Welcome to the podcast to preserve, protect, and defend the soul of America.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
The topic we shall discuss in today's show, the zip code lottery, property taxes, constitutional indifference, and the battle over American school funding.
It is a massive, really heavy topic, but we're going to get right into it.
I'm Alex.
And I'm Sam.
So, to start us off, I want you to imagine, just for a second, getting into your car and driving maybe 3 miles down the road.
Right, just a short trip.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You cross a single intersection, wait for the light to turn green, and drive onto a newly paved street.
And in those 3 miles, you haven't crossed a state line or an international border or anything like that.
No, not at all. But suddenly, the funding for your child's future has just plummeted by like 80%.
It's a staggering drop.
It really is. The buildings are suddenly older, the class sizes are way larger, and the advanced placement courses they completely vanish.
And that's what we are exploring today, this deeply ingrained architectural feature of our society.
Yeah, and the source material we are exploring today has this subtitle that captures it perfectly. It reads, How an Accident of Geography Became the Law of American Education.
And our mission in today's deep dive is to completely deconstruct that accident.
Right.
We are going to unpack exactly how the K-12 education system in the United States became structurally unequal by design.
By design, yeah. That's the key part.
Exactly. We will look at the mechanisms of local funding, the constitutional battles that, cemented this reality in the 1970s, and the cultural DNA that sustains it.
But we'll also contrast that deeply unequal system with a really fascinating paradox, the global dominance of American higher education.
Right, and we're exploring this as an essential foundational chapter in understanding how these two contrasting realities coexist within the exact same country.
So let's look at Detroit, for example. If you drive 20 minutes north from downtown Detroit, you cross this invisible line known as 8 Mile Road.
A very famous line.
Yes, very famous. And on one side, you have a school district that has historically faced just monumental financial collapse.
The infrastructure is crumbling, the teacher turnover is super high.
But the moment your tires cross that asphalt, you are in Grosse Pointe.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and suddenly you're surrounded by leafy, pristine, incredibly well-resourced campuses that look like small liberal arts colleges.
It is a profound physical boundary, right? And it dictates the entire trajectory of the human capital inside those buildings.
And the thing is, it isn't just an isolated Detroit phenomenon. The historical data paints this picture literally everywhere.
You see it all over.
You really do. Like, you can drive from the Edgewood district on San Antonio's working-class west side to the wealthy enclave of Alamo Heights just a few miles away, and you cross another invisible chasm.
Or you can walk from the south side of Chicago to the North Shore suburbs, or from the Bronx to Scarsdale.
In every single one of these cases, children separated by a few miles of pavement are essentially living in entirely different universes of educational opportunity.
And the striking thing about these divides is that nothing, absolutely nothing about the children's intellectual capacity or their ambition or their inherent worth explains the gulf between what those schools can offer them.
It all comes down to a single administrative fact, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Just a line on a map.
Literally just a line.
A line that determines which local government collects property taxes from which homes and then channels that money into which classrooms.
And this is the central, highly peculiar feature of American public education.
You might think of it as a historical quirk, but K-12 education is the only major public service in the United States that is structurally chained to the immediate wealth of the neighborhood it serves.
Yeah, the U.S. is almost entirely unique among wealthy democracies in allowing this kind of geographic inequality to persist, by design.
I really want to break down the actual math here because on the surface, it feels like a glitch in the system.
Yeah.
But it's actually the fundamental architecture.
Let's do it. So nationally, the federal government contributes very little to local schools.
All right, historically, it hovers around, 8 to 9% of total K-12 revenue?
Exactly, 8 to 9%. The remaining, roughly 90%, is split between state aid and local revenue.
And that local revenue comes almost entirely from property taxes.
Which is where the math gets incredibly frustrating. The amount of local revenue a district can raise depends on two main things.
Okay, what are they?
First, the size of its property tax base. That means the total assessed value of all the homes, the factories, commercial buildings inside that line on the map.
Right, the total wealth of the area.
And second, the tax rate the local government actually sets.
And this introduces a critical economic concept, right? known as fiscal capacity.
Yes, fiscal capacity. Let's visualize this for you. Consider a wealthy suburb filled with multi-million-dollar homes, sprawling corporate parks, and thriving high-end retail.
Okay.
They possess an enormous property tax base. Because that pool of wealth is so massive, the local government can set its property tax rate very, very low.
Because a tiny percentage applied to a billion-dollar tax base still yields an absolute fortune for their schools.
Exactly. While the poorer district next door is staring at the exact opposite reality.
Right. A poor urban district or a struggling rural county has a tax base made up of modest homes, perhaps vacant lots, or depressed commercial corridors.
So the total value of that property is incredibly low.
And to raise even a fraction of the money the wealthy suburb raises, the poorer community has to tax itself at a vastly higher rate.
Let me push on that, because this is where the injustice becomes mathematical.
Oh, totally.
The residents in the poorer district are essentially putting in more effort. They are paying a higher percentage of their total wealth in taxes, and yet their schools still end up completely starved for cash.
It's the definition of a feedback loop.
Economists refer to it as a double disadvantage.
Because poorer neighborhoods don't just generate less tax revenue, they actually require vastly more resources to educate their students.
Right, because the students who need the most support are concentrated in the districts with the least capacity to pay for it.
You have higher rates of childhood poverty, greater numbers of English language learners, more specialized special education needs.
And all the cascading effects of housing instability and food insecurity, right?
Exactly. Achieving a baseline of equality in those districts requires higher per pupil spending, yet the fiscal capacity math ensures they receive the least.
And this structural math fuels a phenomenon known as Tiebout sorting, named after the economist Charles Tiebout, who wrote about this in the 1950s.
Oh, right. Voting with their feet.
Yes, the theory posits that people vote with their feet by choosing to live in municipalities that offer the exact mix of taxes and public services they desire.
Which you see playing out in real estate every single day. If you open a real estate app right now, the school district rating is plastered right next to the number of bedrooms and bathrooms.
It is, and by clustering in those desirable districts, families with financial means bid up the home prices specifically to gain access to the school quality.
It creates a self-reinforcing engine.
It does. The good schools drive up the property values, the higher property values generate more tax revenue at a lower rate, and that revenue funds even better schools.
Which raises property values even further.
Exactly. Meanwhile, families without the capital to buy into that neighborhood are trapped in jurisdictions with weaker tax bases and weaker schools.
Let's put this in perspective with an analogy for you. Imagine if we funded the national highway system this way.
That's a great way to think about it.
Right. You were driving along a perfectly paved, multi-lane interstate, and the second you cross into a poorer zip code, the road just crumbles into dirt and potholes, simply because the local residents couldn't generate enough property tax to pave it.
It would be chaos.
Or imagine if the federal court system varied in quality block by block depending on local wealth. Like, if you got a great judge in a rich town and a terrible one in a poor town.
We would never accept that as a society.
We don't fund national defense or Social Security based on municipal wealth. So why do we accept it for the institution tasked with creating equal opportunity?
That is the essential contradiction of the American system. But to fully understand this, we have to look at the counter-narrative, because the data on this is fiercely debated in the source material.
That's true. Institutions like the Thomas B. Fordham Institute have pushed back on the idea that poor schools are systematically underfunded.
Right. If you look at inflation-adjusted per pupil spending across the country, it has actually risen significantly since the mid-20th century.
Furthermore, many states have adopted funding formulas explicitly designed to send more state money to poorer districts to offset that local property tax gap.
And when you factor in federal dollars, specifically Title I money, which was born out of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act to deliberately target poverty, the funding gap in some places appears to flatten out.
Yeah, on a national average, some data sets show poorer districts actually receiving slightly more money per pupil than wealthier ones.
So how do we reconcile that? Are the schools deeply unequal, or are the poorer districts actually getting more money?
Both pictures can be statistically true depending on the lens you use.
How so?
Well, national district-level averages smooth out hyperlocal disparities. The gap isn't always a broad generalization of city versus suburb. Often, it is highly specific in neighboring. Take New Jersey, for example.
Right. You might look at Camden versus Princeton.
A state like New Jersey might have a generally progressive funding formula that sends extra money to Camden, but the local property tax mechanism still allows a Princeton to raise tens of thousands of dollars more per pupil entirely on their own.
The national averages iron out those extremes, and on top of that, district-level data often obscures school-level reality.
Yeah, within a single large district, affluent and poor families often end up in different schools due to housing patterns or selective magnet programs.
Leading to massive internal disparities that a district-wide average completely hides.
Which raises a massive question. If the math is this broken, and it so clearly disadvantages certain zip codes while privileging others, why hasn't anyone simply sued to fix it?
It's the logical next step.
Right. Why didn't someone take this to the Supreme Court and say, hey, this violates the basic premise of equality?
Well, they did. And the outcome of that lawsuit is what permanently locked this geographic system in place.
Right. That brings us to the constitutional settlement of the 1970s, specifically the 1973 Supreme Court case, San Antonio Independent School District v. Rodriguez.
This case is the absolute bedrock of modern American school funding.
Let's talk about the lead plaintiff, Demetrio Rodriguez. He was a veteran, a sheet metal worker, and a parent living in the Edgewood Independent School District in San Antonio.
And Edgewood was an overwhelmingly Mexican-American working-class district.
The conditions in Edgewood were just dire. The buildings were crumbling, they lacked basic supplies, and they had one of the highest tax rates in the area.
They were taxing themselves into the ground and barely raising a fraction of what they needed. Edgewood had about $5,960 of taxable property per pupil.
Meanwhile, just a few miles away was Alamo Heights, which was an affluent, predominantly white district. Alamo Heights had a tax base of roughly $49,000 per pupil.
More than 8 times as much wealth to draw from. The disparity was just staggering.
So the plaintiffs sued, arguing that Texas's reliance on local property taxes for school finance violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
They built their legal theory on 2 main killers. First, they argued that wealth should be considered a suspect classification.
Okay, so in constitutional law, a suspect classification is a category like race or national origin that triggers the highest level of judicial scrutiny, known as strict scrutiny, right?
Exactly. The plaintiffs argued that wealth-based discrimination in education tracked an immutable circumstance of birth.
Because a child cannot control the wealth of the neighborhood they're born into.
Right, and therefore the court should view any system that penalizes them for it with extreme skepticism.
And the second pillar was claiming that education itself is a fundamental right.
They argued it is implicitly protected by the Constitution, much like the right to vote or the right to a fair trial.
Because without education, you really cannot meaningfully exercise your free speech or participate in the democratic process.
Exactly. If education is a fundamental right, then unequal funding severely burdens that right and must be struck down.
But the Supreme Court, in a very narrow decision, rejected both arguments.
In a 5-4 decision, Justice Lewis Powell wrote the majority opinion. The court refused to classify wealth as a suspect class in this context.
How did Justice Powell justify that? I mean, looking at Edgewood versus Alamo Heights, it seems undeniable that the system was discriminating against poor communities.
Well, Justice Powell reasoned that the Texas system didn't actually discriminate against a cleanly definable class of poor people.
Right.
He pointed out that the disparities track the wealth of the school districts, not necessarily the individual families.
So some poor families lived in property-rich districts, perhaps heavily industrial areas, with power plants that generated massive tax revenue.
And some property-poor districts didn't necessarily have high concentrations of impoverished families. Because the disadvantaged class couldn't be universally and cleanly defined, the court refused to apply strict scrutiny.
But what about education being a fundamental right? That seems like a much harder argument to dismiss.
It really does, and this remains one of the most debated aspects of the ruling. Powell acknowledged that education is incredibly important to a functioning democracy.
Okay.
But he stated firmly, societal importance does not equal a constitutional right. Because education is nowhere explicitly mentioned in the text of the U.S. Constitution, it is not a fundamental right guaranteed by federal law.
So the state of Texas only needed to prove they had a legitimate reason for organizing the system this way, even if it was flawed.
Yes. And the court decided that the preservation of local control, allowing local communities the power to tax themselves and run their own schools, was a perfectly legitimate governmental interest.
So the Supreme Court essentially told reformers, yes, this system is entirely unfair, it produces massive disparities, but it is not illegal under the federal Constitution.
That is the tragic reality of Rodriguez. Powell conceded the system was imperfect, but concluded that imperfection is not unconstitutionality.
Wow.
Thurgood Marshall, who had famously argued Brown v. Board of Education 2 decades earlier, wrote a blistering dissent.
He argued that education is inextricably tied to the meaningful exercise of other constitutional rights, didn't he?
He did. He viewed the majority's decision as an abdication of the court's duty and a retreat from the historic commitment to equal educational opportunity.
Demetrio Rodriguez, after fighting for years, famously responded to the ruling by saying, "The poor people have lost again."
And the practical consequence of Rodriguez was monumental. The federal courts completely washed their hands of school funding equity.
They threw the entire battle back to the 50 individual states.
Every fight for school funding since 1973 has had to happen in state courts, arguing under 50 different state constitutions.
Which has led to a wildly uneven patchwork of success and failure across the country.
And if slamming the door on funding wasn't enough, we have to look at another case from that exact same era that compounded this issue. The 1974 case, Milliken v. Bradley.
Right. Where Rodriguez was about the money and the wealth, Milliken was about the physical boundaries of the school districts and the demographics inside them.
Let's set the stage here. Following Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, federal courts had spent 2 decades dismantling segregated school systems in the South where state laws had explicitly mandated them.
That was the segregation by law.
Right. But when the courts turned their attention to northern and midwestern cities in the 1970s, the situation looked different on paper, but identical in practice.
The courts were confronting what they called de facto segregation, in fact.
In Detroit, for example, the city's student population had become overwhelmingly black, while the surrounding suburbs were overwhelmingly white.
Now, looking at the historical record from the source material, this demographic shift was not an organic accident.
It was the cumulative effect of explicit historical housing discrimination, white flight to the suburbs, redlining by federal mortgage agencies, and racially restrictive deed covenants that legally prevented black families from moving into those growing suburbs.
The federal district judge looking at Detroit recognized this reality. He saw that because the city was overwhelmingly black and the surrounding suburbs were overwhelmingly white, any desegregation plan limited only to the city limits of Detroit wouldn't actually integrate anything.
You would just be shuffling black students from one segregated school to another within the city.
So the lower court ordered a massive multi-district busing plan that would cross municipal lines, combining Detroit with 53 surrounding suburban districts.
It was a radical attempt to solve the geographic sorting, but the Supreme Court stepped in again. Just 1 year after Rodriguez, by the exact same 5-4 margin, the Supreme Court struck down the multi-district busing plan.
They ruled that federal courts could not force desegregation across district lines unless there was explicit proof that the suburban districts themselves had actively caused the segregation through their own policies.
Which was an impossible standard to meet. The suburbs could simply point to the district lines and say, hey, we didn't cause the housing patterns, we just happen to live here.
Effectively, Rodriguez and Milliken together enshrined the school district boundary as legally sacrosanct.
Yes. A wealthy district could not be forced to share its tax base, and a white suburban district could not be forced to share its desegregation burden with a struggling central city.
So let's synthesize where this leaves us in the late 1970s for the listener. The federal door was slammed shut on fixing the tax base, and it was slammed shut on redrawing the geographic lines to integrate schools.
If you were a parent in a failing district, you couldn't sue for more money, and you couldn't cross the district line.
So what were reformers left with?
Desperation. They realized they couldn't fix the geography from within the traditional system, so they tried to create escape hatches instead.
If you can't change the neighborhood, you have to find a way to let the student leave the neighborhood's designated school.
And that desperation birthed what we now know as the school choice movement.
Let's trace the evolution of the choice movement, because its origins are entirely counterintuitive compared to today's political landscape. Charter schools, which began in Minnesota in 1991 and California in 1992, actually had surprisingly progressive roots.
It's a really fascinating historical footnote. One of the early champions of the charter school concept was Albert Shanker, the legendary president of the American Federation of Teachers.
Wait, really? The head of the teachers union was pushing for charter schools?
He was. The original idea was essentially an autonomy for accountability bargain, driven by a desire to empower teachers.
So a charter school is a public school. It is tuition-free, publicly funded, and open to all.
But in exchange for operating free from the traditional district bureaucracy and strict union contracts, they could experiment. They could try new teaching methods, longer school days, or different curricula.
And if they failed to perform, their charter would be revoked.
Right. Schenker envisioned these as teacher-led incubators that would innovate and then bring those successful innovations back into the traditional public system.
But over 30 years, that bipartisan experiment mutated into an incredibly polarized partisan battleground.
Today, the most vocal champions of charter expansion tend to be free market-oriented Republicans, libertarian donors, and philanthropic networks.
On the flip side, the major teachers' unions and traditional public school advocates have become the sector's fiercest opponents.
The criticisms are intense. Critics argue that charters drain essential operating money from traditional public schools, creating a fiscal death spiral.
Furthermore, they argue that while charters are nominally open to all, they often manage to screen out the highest need students, those with severe behavioral issues or profound special needs,
Leaving the traditional public schools with fewer resources to handle the most expensive educational challenges.
while advocates point to rigorous econometric studies showing that certain high-structure urban charter networks like Success Academy or KIPP produce substantial, undeniable achievement gains for low-income and minority students.
They argue the money is simply following the student, giving disadvantaged families the kind of choice that wealthy families already exercise through the real estate market.
But charters are just one piece of this puzzle, and honestly, they feel kind of quaint compared to the current battles. The much sharper edge of the choice movement right now involves channeling public money completely outside the public sector.
We are talking about vouchers and education savings accounts, or ESAs.
This is where the landscape is changing at a breathtaking pace. A traditional voucher is a fixed sum of public money given to a family to apply directly to private school tuition.
But an ESA takes that concept and just supercharges it. It's essentially a government-funded spending account that parents can use on a wide menu of approved educational items.
So you can use it for private school tuition, but you can also use it for private tutors, online courses, educational therapies, or even homeschooling supplies.
And the scale of this explosion is massive. By the mid-2020s, over half of U.S. states had some private choice program. Florida alone has 500,000 students using these funds.
Arizona, Ohio, and Texas have all poured billions into these systems. But looking at the legislative fights, the politics are not purely a left versus right binary.
No, not at all. There's a very specific intra-party battle among Republicans, particularly in rural areas.
Why do you think rural legislators who might be deeply conservative often oppose voucher expansion?
Because of the geography. In many rural districts, there are no private schools within a 50-mile radius. The local public school is the absolute heart of the community.
It's where Friday night football happens, it's the social center, and crucially, it is often the single largest employer in the entire town.
The economic realities drive the politics. To a rural legislator, a voucher program looks like draining money out of their local economic engine, their local public school, to subsidize private school tuitions in the distant urban and suburban centers where the private schools actually exist.
Governor Greg Abbott in Texas had to spend enormous political capital primarying members of his own party in rural districts just to force an ESB program through. It highlights how complex this issue really is on the ground.
And this raises a profound paradox about the modern choice movement. The whole moral argument for school choice, dating back to the 1990s, was to fix the zip code lottery, right?
It was meant to give poor kids an escape route from failing neighborhood schools.
But when you look at universal ESAs where there is no income cap, meaning a billionaire could theoretically claim the funds, do they just end up acting as a taxpayer subsidy for wealthy families who are already paying for private school anyway?
That is the primary critique of the universal model. State-level analyses of the rollout in places like Arizona and Florida show that the vast majority of the early adopters of universal ESA programs were families whose children were already enrolled in private schools.
So instead of newly giving access to low-income families, the program effectively provides a massive state tax cut to families who had already opted out of the public system,
draining the state's general education fund in the process.
And once you open the floodgates of public money flowing into private education, it was only a matter of time before it hit the ultimate constitutional religion.
Let's explore the legal earthquake brewing in Oklahoma, the St. Isidore saga.
This is arguably the most consequential, unresolved legal question in American education today. It involves an attempt by the Catholic Archdiocese of Oklahoma to create the St. Isidore of Seville Catholic Virtual School.
The goal was to create the nation's first publicly funded, explicitly religious Catholic charter school.
Right. It was designed to teach Catholic doctrine, require participation in Mass, and weave theology into every subject while drawing its operating funds directly from the state's public charter school budget.
This sets up an incredible head-on collision within the First Amendment.
It's a profound conceptual clash between two clauses. On one side, you have the Establishment Clause, which prohibits the government from establishing a religion.
And the argument against St. Isidore is that because state law designates charter schools as public schools, they're an arm of the state.
Therefore, funding a school that explicitly evangelizes a specific religion violates the prohibition against state-sponsored religion. It's forcing taxpayers of all faiths, or no faith, to fund Catholic indoctrination.
But on the other side, you have the Free Exercise Clause.
Exactly. The counterargument, heavily supported by recent Supreme Court jurisprudence, posits that charter schools are not state actors, but rather private contractors delivering an educational service to the state.
And the Supreme Court has ruled in cases like Trinity Lutheran and Carson v. Macon that a state cannot exclude a religious institution from a generally available public benefit program simply because it is religious.
Doing so, they argue, is unconstitutional religious discrimination.
So if Oklahoma offers charter school contracts to secular nonprofits, the Free Exercise Clause demands they offer them to religious nonprofits as well.
That is the argument. The Oklahoma Supreme Court ruled against the school, stating it was unconstitutional to fund it under state law. The case was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and then something highly unusual happened.
We got a 4-4 tie.
Justice Amy Coney Barrett recused herself, reportedly due to past ties with attorneys or organizations involved in the case.
A 4-4 tie means the lower court ruling stands. So St. Isidore is blocked for now, but it doesn't set a national precedent.
It leaves a massive constitutional question entirely unresolved, dangling over the education sector.
If a future Supreme Court rules that states are required to fund religious charter schools under the Free Exercise Clause, it would completely transform the charter sector.
It would evolve from an experimental public education vehicle into a parallel system of taxpayer-funded religious schooling across the country.
We see how fiercely Americans fight over these incredibly scarce K-12 resources. We are battling over property tax lines, charter school caps, universal vouchers, and religious funding.
It is a system defined by scarcity and geographic trapping.
But then, when we look at higher education, the United States absolutely dominates the globe. How do these two realities coexist?
It is a striking paradox. It is crucial to understand that American K-12 and American higher education are not two halves of a single continuous system. They operate on entirely different structural logics.
The same country that is failing a third grader in a neglected urban district because of a property tax line is simultaneously housing Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Yale, and Caltech.
The difference is entirely structural. K-12 education is compulsory, universally assigned by geographic residence, and funded locally.
While higher education is globally competitive, selectively admitted, and funded through a massive engine of federal grants, private tuition, and philanthropic wealth.
Let's dig into why American higher ed is so globally dominant. It traces back to a specific historical decision made right after World War II.
Following the war, the U.S. government, guided by figures like Vannevar Bush, made a deliberate choice about how to fund scientific research for the Cold War era.
In many European countries, the government built separate, dedicated national research institutes that were completely decoupled from universities. But the U.S. decided to channel its massive defense and scientific research funding directly through university faculties.
Through agencies like the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health.
By funneling the money this way, it entangled cutting-edge scientific research with undergraduate and graduate teaching.
It created an incredible self-sustaining, virtuous cycle.
Massive federal money attracts the world's top scientific minds. Those scholars attract the brightest graduate students from across the globe.
That concentration of talent attracts even more federal and private grants, which builds world-class laboratories, which in turn attracts the next generation of top scholars.
Add in the historical prestige of places like Harvard, which is literally older than the United States itself, and the massive private endowments fueled by Wall Street alumni, and you have a system with financial resources that dwarf universities anywhere else in the world.
But we cannot ignore that this higher education system is also intensely stratified and unequal. It just relies on a different kind of inequality than K-12.
How so?
Well, this brings up a connection I can't shake. I look at the admissions process for these elite universities, and I see a profound illusion of meritocracy.
Right.
K-12 inequality is assigned at birth, based purely on the zip code your parents could afford. But higher education inequality feels earned through academic achievement. It's highly selective.
But isn't that academic achievement almost entirely shaped by the K-12 zip code lottery you just survived?
That is the crucial insight, exactly. A student who attends a well-funded, college prep-heavy public school in a wealthy suburb arrives at the college application stage with enormous systematic advantages.
They've had access to 12 years of AP courses, sophisticated college counseling, extensive extracurriculars, and costly standardized test prep.
The higher ed system distributes its resources based on a competitive process that nominally rewards merit.
But that merit is heavily socially laundered from the inherited advantages of the K-12 system.
It makes people feel like the winners earn their spot entirely on their own intellect and grit, ignoring the 1,000-yard head start they received at birth because of a property tax line.
And to truly understand why Americans tolerate this intense stratification, both in K-12 and higher ed, we have to look beneath the policy. We have to examine the deep cultural DNA and the historical mythologies that built this entire structure.
Let's go all the way back to the 1830s and look at Horace Mann and the Common School movement.
Horace Mann is often called the father of American public education. He envisioned the public school as the great equalizer of American society.
He was operating as the secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education, and he wanted a system of universal education that would dissolve class privileges and assimilate a growing nation.
But to get it passed, he made what historians describe as a fatal compromise. He wanted centralized universal standards for curriculum and teacher training, but he relied on the deep-seated New England tradition of hyper-local town funding to pay for it.
In the 1830s, in relatively egalitarian, small agrarian or mill towns, relying on local property taxes wasn't instantly fatal to equality.
But as America industrialized, as wealth rapidly concentrated in major cities, as the Great Migration occurred, and as the post-WWII suburban explosion aggressively sorted the metropolis by wealth and race.
That reliance on local funding became an engine for producing massive inequity.
And nothing illustrates the modern consequence of this deeply ingrained reliance on local property wealth better than California's Proposition 13 in 1978. It is a perfect case study of how tax policy accidentally, yet permanently, reshapes education.
Let's walk through what happened in California because it is wild. In the early 1970s, the California Supreme Court, in a case called Serrano v. Priest, ordered the state to equalize its profoundly unequal school funding.
The legislature responded by capping high-spending districts and boosting aid to low-spending ones.
But then came the tax revolt of 1978. Driven by rampant inflation and skyrocketing property values in California, fixed-income homeowners were terrified of losing their homes to massive, unpredictable property tax bills.
The political face of the movement was the elderly widow who had bought her home decades ago and could no longer afford the taxes.
The voters overwhelmingly passed Proposition 13.
Yeah.
It slashed property tax rates to 1% of assessed value, which is low, but the vital part is that it froze those property assessments at 1975 values,
allowing them to rise by a maximum of only 2% a year until the property was sold.
Let's do the math on that to show how visceral the impact is. Imagine two identical houses side by side in Los Angeles today. One is owned by a family who bought it in 1978.
Because of the Prop 13 freeze, they are paying property taxes based on a valuation of perhaps $50,000.
Right. And the house next door just sold to a young family for $2 million. They're paying taxes based on a $2 million valuation.
Same neighborhood, identical houses, wildly different contributions to the civic infrastructure.
The immediate fiscal effect in 1978 was to absolutely gut local property tax revenues across the entire state of California.
In a grim twist of fate, California schools were suddenly equalized by starving almost all of them of funding.
The burden shifted entirely to the state capital in Sacramento to fill the gap using more volatile income and sales taxes. California plummeted from being one of the highest spending states per pupil to one of the lowest.
But not every district was starved. Prop 13 created a loophole for districts sitting on liquid gold, known as basic aid districts.
What is a basic aid district?
These are districts located in places like Silicon Valley or ultra-wealthy coastal enclaves, sitting on some of the most valuable real estate on Earth.
Oh, wow.
Because their commercial and residential property values are so astronomically high, even with the Prop 13 1% cap and the assessment freezes, they generate so much local tax revenue that they exceed what the state equalization formula would give them.
So they simply opt out of the state's equalization math altogether.
They keep their local property wealth and hoard it locally, funding incredible schools while the rest of the state relies on Sacramento.
It is a brilliant, entirely legal mechanism to protect advantage. Which brings us to the cultural philosophy justifying all of this. We discussed meritocracy earlier, and philosopher Michael Sandel writes extensively about the meritocracy myth.
Americans have a deeply held cultural belief in rewarding effort and identifying individual talent. We want to believe that anyone, regardless of background, can rise to the top through hard work.
But as Sandel argues, when the starting line is dictated by property wealth, meritocracy ceases to be a measure of individual excellence.
It becomes a system for socially laundering inherited advantage. It allows the winners to feel morally justified in their success, believing they earned it through hard work, while implicitly blaming the losers for their failure, ignoring the systemic hurdles in their way.
And whenever reformers try to dismantle this system, it is always defended using the language of local control.
Local control isn't just a policy preference, it is a foundational American value. It dates back to colonial Protestant communities fiercely resisting distant authorities, whether in London or in the state capital, telling them how to educate their children or spend their money.
It holds enormous cultural resonance across the political spectrum.
But looking historically, does the language of local control sometimes serve as a polite, race-neutral way to defend segregated wealth?
The historical records show this explicitly. When explicit, legal racial segregation became unavailable after Brown v. Board, the intense resistance to school integration often wrapped itself in the race-neutral language of local control, neighborhood identity, and protecting property values.
The clustering of affluent, predominantly white families into homogeneous suburban school districts provided a mechanism for maintaining separation simply by invoking municipal boundaries and property rights.
The system's current racial and economic effects are not an accident. They are the fossilized record of those historical choices.
These abstract cultural philosophies and financial disparities don't just stay on spreadsheets or in history books. They dictate the human reality inside the school buildings today.
Let's look at the human cost, focusing on the teachers, the principals, and the physical buildings themselves.
Let's start with the teacher labor market. Because a dollar spent in a poor district is not buying the same thing as a dollar spent in a rich district. Experience is one of the most consistent, data-backed predictors of student achievement, with teacher effectiveness rising steeply in the first 5 to 10 years in the classroom.
But teachers are not randomly distributed across the landscape. Better-funded districts can offer significantly higher salaries, smaller class sizes, better-maintained facilities, and more planning time.
Consequently, they recruit and retain the veterans. Meanwhile, high-poverty, underfunded districts offer harder working conditions, larger classes, outdated materials, and lower pay.
They face massive, destabilizing turnover. In some struggling urban districts, the average teacher experience level is measured in months, not years.
So the wealthy district gets the 10-year veteran who has mastered their craft, and the poor district gets the first-year novice who often burns out and leaves before they ever reach peak effectiveness.
And it is the exact same story for the principal pipeline.
School leadership is critical to turning a school around. But principals in urban, high-poverty schools are managing higher rates of student trauma, staggering teacher turnover, and crumbling facilities, often for less pay than their suburban counterparts.
This leads to rapid burnout, creating administrative instability that cascades down and compounds the instructional instability in the classrooms.
You mentioned crumbling facilities. Researchers call this the hidden curriculum of facilities. The numbers here are staggering. There is a $380 billion deferred maintenance backlog in U.S. schools.
Half of the nation's public school buildings need major repairs or complete replacement. And predictably, that backlog is heavily concentrated in districts serving low-income and minority students, or in deeply under-resourced rural areas.
Put yourself in the shoes of a student in this system for a second. Imagine trying to learn biology in a classroom built in the 1950s. The roof leaks when it rains, the heating system is broken in January, and the gymnasium floods every spring.
And, because you have a smartphone and access to the internet, that a kid 10 miles away is learning biology in a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled genetics lab with a broadcast journalism studio down the hall.
What does that crumbling building tell that student about their worth to society?
It communicates a visceral, inescapable message about how much the system values their future. It is a daily, physical reminder of inequality.
Yep.
And what makes it worse is how capital financing actually works in this country.
Right, because the money for building renovations doesn't usually come from the general operating budget.
It comes from issuing municipal bonds, general obligation bonds. To pay back those bonds, districts rely on their local property tax base.
Because poor districts have weak tax bases and higher rates of poverty, Wall Street assigns them a lower credit rating.
That means when they borrow money to fix a leaking roof or replace a broken boiler, they are charged a higher interest rate than a wealthy district borrowing money to build a new performing arts center.
The poor district literally pays a premium for being poor.
It is maddening when you map out the mechanics. So if this hyper-local property tax-based system is so uniquely American, what did the rest of the developed world choose to do instead?
We can look at how America's peer nations organize their funding and human capital to see what alternative structures look like.
Let's start with Finland, because Finland always comes up as the utopian ideal in education debates.
Finland funds its schools primarily through national and municipal channels using a heavily progressive formula. They explicitly send substantially more money to municipalities with higher concentrations of disadvantaged students.
They have incredibly high teacher prestige. Teachers are drawn from the top third of university graduates and require a master's degree.
The variation in school quality between their best funded and least funded municipalities is minimal.
And it pays off their international testing scores, particularly at the bottom end. Their lowest performing students perform significantly better than America's lowest performing students.
Now, Finland is a smaller, much more homogeneous country, so it's not a perfect parallel, but it proves that nationalizing resource allocation fundamentally changes the baseline of quality.
Well, let's look at South Korea. They utilize centralized funding combined with a deeply intense meritocratic culture. They consistently rank at the top globally in math and reading.
It demonstrates that a centrally funded, standardized system can be both equitable in resources and highly demanding in academics, challenging the American assumption that equality and excellence are somehow mutually exclusive.
Though it's worth noting, they have a massive, highly pressurized private tutoring sector, the Hagwons, which creates its own intense socioeconomic pressures outside of school hours.
Yes, the shadow education system there is intense. But the baseline public school funding is centralized. In Germany, funding happens at the state level, the lender, without relying on local municipal property taxes.
This minimizes the extreme variations between neighboring towns within a state. And Japan takes it a step further regarding human capital.
This is the most fascinating comparison to me. Japan deliberately rotates their teachers.
They do. In Japan, teachers are essentially civil servants for the prefecture, not employees of a specific local district.
They are routinely rotated between high-prestige urban schools and lower-prestige rural or disadvantaged schools. It ensures an equitable distribution of experienced talent across the entire demographic spectrum.
Can you imagine proposing forced teacher rotation in the United States? The suburban districts would absolutely riot. Parents buy homes specifically to lock in access to those veteran teachers.
It is entirely antithetical to the American competitive labor market model and our deeply held belief in local control. But it shows how other nations prioritize systemic equity over local hoarding.
This brings up the ultimate question that always seems to derail these debates. Does money actually matter?
For years, in the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a prevalent argument that throwing money at failing schools wouldn't fix anything, that the problems were purely cultural or administrative.
That skepticism was driven by researchers looking at weak correlations between spending and test scores in certain cross-sectional studies. But the more recent, rigorous econometric data has substantially changed the consensus. We have to look at the landmark study by researcher Rucker Johnson and economist Christopher Kirwan.
How did they finally prove that money matters?
They used a brilliant methodology. They tracked quasi-random variations in school funding caused by court orders. When a state Supreme Court ordered a sudden infusion of cash into poor districts, Johnson and Kirwan tracked the students who experienced that funding boost and compared them to similar students who didn't.
And what did the data show?
The results were profound. They found that a 10% increase in per-pupil spending throughout a child's 12 years of schooling was associated with a 7% increase in their adult wages and a 3.7 percentage point drop in their incidence of adult poverty.
That is massive. It proves that the investment directly alters the trajectory of their adult lives.
It does. Money absolutely matters, especially for low-income students. But the caveat is that it matters when it is spent on structural inputs, smaller class sizes, increasing salaries to retain experienced teachers, and upgrading physical facilities, rather than being swallowed by administrative bloat.
And as we look at the current landscape, there are some wild cards for the year 2025 that could disrupt the one area where America remains globally dominant: higher education.
We are seeing significant proposed cuts to federal research funding and sharp new restrictions on international student visas.
If the federal pipeline of research money shrinks, and if the U.S. ceases to be the default, welcoming destination for the world's most ambitious international scholars, the self-reinforcing advantage of American research universities could seriously erode.
We could lose the crown jewel of our educational system.
So we know the K-12 system is deeply structurally flawed, and the higher ed system might be facing a looming crisis. What would genuine reform actually look like for the zip code lottery? Are we talking about establishing a federal funding floor?
A federal funding floor would guarantee a minimum amount of per-pupil spending nationwide, regardless of local wealth. At the state level, genuine reform would require comprehensively moving away from property taxes entirely and shifting towards state general fund allocations that are heavily weighted to provide more money for student need.
But the most effective reform is the one that is considered the absolute third rail of local politics.
Consolidating school districts, especially in major metropolitan areas where dozens of separate fragmented districts were essentially drawn over the last century to maintain economic and racial separation.
If you consolidate districts into larger, county-wide systems, you eliminate the boundary that allows a wealthy enclave to sit right next to an impoverished district without sharing a tax base.
But wealthy communities would fight that tooth and nail. They paid a massive premium for those homes specifically to secure that exclusive boundary and hoard that tax base.
Which is why the political obstacle to consolidation is nearly insurmountable in most of the country.
When you lay all of this out, the property tax math, the 1970s court cases, the crumbling facilities, the illusion of meritocracy, it leaves us with a heavy, provocative question to mull over.
Yeah, it really does.
When we look at the zip code lottery, the profound inequality it generates from birth, the way it protects accumulated wealth, and the ferocity with which it is defended by those who benefit from it. We have to ask, is this a system that is broken?
Or is it a system working exactly as it was designed to, protecting the advantages of those who already have them?
Will America ever find the political will to renegotiate its basic social contract regarding what a child is owed, simply by virtue of being an American, regardless of the zip code of their birthplace?
That is the defining question of our educational future.
This entire deep dive was derived from the first book of the 30-volume series, To Preserve, Protect, and Defend the Soul of America.
Yes.
Volume 1, America's Healthcare Crisis and Broken Public Institutions.
Exactly.
Authored by Sue B. Howell.
And that book is now available in all Amazon bookstores across the world.
We highly encourage you to go check out the book, leave comments, and provide your feedback. The historical research and the data synthesis in there are truly paradigm shifting.
It really is an essential read to understand the architecture of these broken institutions. Go find it on Amazon today.
Think about that invisible line on the asphalt the next time you drive through a city. Until next time.